Call the meeting to order. Do we have any substitutions?
David Kuhn for Kevin Arsenault.
You got to write them down. Just a minute, people. Johnson for. Johnson for. Johnson for Dawson. Any other substitutions? Is it the pleasure of the committee to take into consideration Bill number 23, an act to amend the Public Service Labour Relations Act? All those in favour, please say yay. Yay. Against, nay? Carried. Minister, would you like to have any opening remarks and maybe introduce your staff?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I have Dan Mills, my my Deputy Minister, Mike Murray, my Assistant Deputy Minister, and Trish Noble from the department as well. And there's been a robust debate on this bill already, and I just look forward to the members' questions.
Thank you very much, member.
Mr. Chair, and welcome to staff. And obviously, we've debated the closure motion, so we don't have a lot of time, so I'll try to be as precise as I can with my questions. First question will be concerning consultation. So I kind of just want to know, when did staff start drafting this legislation, or, this bill?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chairman, to the member opposite, I just want to say one thing for a second here, and that's that one of the, I would say, the primary responsibility of any Minister of Labour, whoever that is at any given time, is to try and provide balance and to try and make sure that where at all possible there's clarity to legislation to make sure that disputes are settled as effectively and impartially as possible. And just before I get into in terms of the timing and everything else that the member opposite's asking me about, this for me has always been about making sure that essential services for the health and safety of New Brunswickers is maintained. And I'm talking about a level of service, as I've said a number of times in this House already, that level of service is maintained, and that the level of employees required is maintained based on something that was already agreed to by both the employer and the employees. And if they don't come to a resolution, as I've said many times before, that's also up to the Labour or Employment Board to determine what that level of designation is required to keep New Brunswickers safe at the end of the day. And that's all this has been about from my perspective. There were a number of Labour Board decisions a little over a year ago where it was felt that there needed to be some clarity brought to the legislation around essential services. In terms of timing, there's been an ongoing conversation throughout the fall. I'm not going to talk about, cabinet and what was discussed there, but throughout the fall, it was clearly indicated in the throne speech that I think we used the word clarity, and I don't know that we used the word modernization, but those would be my words. And I think it's also important that these type of changes and clarity be brought at a time when there's no work stoppage, when there's no strikes being underway. And I think there's always, in terms of timing, it's never a good time to have these conversations. But at the end of the day, you want to make sure that you're doing that at a time when it's not in the middle of a current labor stoppage or work stoppage. So it was felt that this was as good a time as ever to bring forward this kind of modernization, and it's all about making sure that an essential level of service is maintained for the safety and security and the health of New Brunswickers.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So you feel better? You got that out of your system, those key speaking points? Like, are you going to use them before every question that I ask? It was actually quite simple. It was almost like and the huddle for 20 minutes just to come out with a date that you didn't even share with us. It shows a little bit how you're kind of starting right on the defensive, Minister, on this one. All I ask is I want to know, because obviously all the unions came out and they said that they were never consulted beforehand. All they got was a briefing a couple of days before the bill was tabled. All I want to know is, when did you and your staff start writing this legislation? I'm hearing July. I'm just wondering if you can confirm that your department started working on this in July.
Mr. Chairman, I can tell you the legislation was ready, and within a matter of weeks, we sat down the department sat down and gave a briefing to members from the Labour movement, and we tabled the legislation within that week. That was the time frame.
So I'll take July, because that's what I'm hearing here on the floor. So July, August, September, October, November. 4 months. 4 months you've been working on this legislation.
Point of order,
Go
Mr.
ahead.
Chairman.
Go ahead.
I never said July. Maybe he wants to table where he got that information.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I did say July, and I'll stick with July. You didn't actually contradict me on this one. I asked you when you started work on the legislation, and you were very vague with your answer. So I'm saying July because that's what I'm hearing, from people, on the ground. So 4 months, you guys have been working on this legislation, and not one word to the unions until a few days before you table it, when you actually gave them a small briefing, which was about 15, 20 minutes, and you just highlighted the 7 changes that you wanted to bring to the bill. And that consultation part, Minister, is on you. I will not blame staff or department for it, because you're the head of that department, and consultation falls under your responsibility. What I want to know, if you're not going to answer that question, so obviously we're here for a little while, what instigated this bill? why was it, like, was there an issue that came up that says, listen, we got to do this? Like, the unions are actually scratching their heads saying, well, why all of a sudden are they bringing this bill forward? And they haven't had an answer. So I'm asking you today, why did you order your department to start working on this legislation?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, in that what he described as the preamble that he was glad I got off my chest, if he'd actually listened to what I said there was a number of Labour Board decisions over the last year, and it was felt that we needed to bring some clarity because of those decisions. That's what drove it.
Was that information shared with the unions? Because why are they all surprised that this was tabled? That's what they don't understand.
So, Mr. Chairman, to the member opposite, with respect to his question around was that discussed, I mean, certainly when staff sat down with members from the labor unions, it was very clear that there was concern around an essential level of service being maintained and provided. That would have been very clear when this was discussed with them, and it was certainly clear in the conversations that I've had with a number of members from the labor movement over the last week. I had a meeting on Monday with CUPE representatives and with members from Unifor, and I said that was essentially what was driving it. So yes, that has been communicated. And I will go back to my point. The reason that this is important is there were a number of labor board decisions, and the member opposite, they're public record. Anybody in this House, any New Brunswicker can go and read those decisions, and there was some concern over the clarity around whether or not essential services were able to be maintained. This is simply about bringing clarity to legislation so that is not in question. This is simply about protecting New Brunswickers and that level of service. I'll say it again, that's what this is about. We should not try and turn this into something other than that. That has been communicated to members of the labor movement community by my staff, by conversations that I've had here over the last couple of weeks in this building, with members from CUPE and in my office as recently as this Monday, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Something doesn't add up, because obviously when you speak with the unions, they're saying that never was there an occasion where there was an issue with designation levels. And if there was, there's obviously a process already in place, and this should have been discussed before actually bringing this legislation. So you're trying to convince everyone that there was an issue, it was never addressed, the Labor Board recommended these changes, and you come in heavy-handed and you actually want to amend the law, the actual law, without actually having anybody on board. Because they're, and I'm using the term from the Minister of Education, they're baffled by the fact, well, where is this coming from? Where is this coming from? Because designation levels have never really been discussed. If there was an issue, they would have liked to know. They would have liked to know about it. And if there was an issue, then there's already a process in place. So why did you find, Minister, why was it necessary for you to go a step further and say, listen, the process that's already in place that we've probably, I don't know if you've ever used it. Maybe you could actually answer that when you get up. That wasn't working, so that's why we had to go a step further and bring in even more changes. So I don't know if you can maybe just comment on that.
So at the end of those points, and member opposite asked me to comment, Mr. Chairman, on how the designation levels are set. And I mean, essentially, both sides, in any situation where there is a designated level of service that's required, as I've said a couple of times here today, and I've said it a couple of times over the last couple of weeks, I've said it in question period, when there is a level of service that is required for the safety and security of New Brunswickers and their welfare, then both sides have an opportunity to come to an agreement on what that designated level should be. Both sides submit their position on that. At the end of the day, the Labor and Employment Board has to, based on what both sides are asking for, sets what the Labor and Employment Board feels is a reasonable designation level. And only the Labor and Employment Board can set that. So what we're not talking today about trying to override the Labor and Employment Board. All we're trying to do is bring, I keep using the word clarity, but when there are situations, and I invite the member opposite to look at a number of Labor and Employment Board decisions that have happened and the arguments that were made, both sides of the equation, but there have been some concern over time about whether or not designated levels are being met, especially as a work stoppage continues to move on. And at the end of the day, nobody is trying to unilaterally change those designation levels. Both sides, even under the current changes that are being proposed here, you can't have the employers or the employees ever show up and just unilaterally change those designation levels. The Labor and Employment Board sets that out. We're just trying to give some clarity to, in that case, what they have at their disposal to work with to make sure that that level of service is maintained. This is about making sure we protect New Brunswickers. I gotta think the member opposite believes that. I gotta believe the member opposite believes that at the end of the day, if there is an essential service out there that is not being maintained and puts the lives of New Brunswickers at risk, that he'd want some clarity around that. I would hope the member opposite would be on the same page as the rest of us on that. That's all we're trying to accomplish here. I really believe that from the beginning of this discussion a month or so ago, that people have jumped to conclusions way too quickly about what we're trying to do here. So that's how he asked me to comment on how the process works. That's how the process works in a Coles Notes version of it, Mr. Chairman. And there have been, I'll say to the member opposite, you can look at some of the decisions over the years and some of the arguments made on both sides. We just want to make sure that New Brunswickers are protected. We're not in any way, shape, or form trying to interfere with the strike itself. Not for a minute. We're just simply trying to make sure that a level of service that the people of New Brunswick need and deserve is protected.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So for those who are watching, unions and employees, members of different unions across the province, I've been in committee for the last 4 years. I was actually part of economic policy, and this minister came before the committee many, many times, and I've never seen him take so much time to answer a question. We've been here half an hour. I was able to ask 3 questions, and it's not right. You've already put closure motion in place. We're trying to get information. Now, I'm going to pivot a little bit and try to be very specific, but I know he thinks it's a joke, but we're trying to get information, and that's why we're here, in committee.
I have never taken my work on the floor of this assembly as a joke. And for him to even suggest that is not only offensive, but it's a joke.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So my question is, can you give me an example, a clear example of when designation levels were not met, and what was done? Like, once you give us that example, what did government do to address this? Did they actually, pick up the phone and call the unions and say, listen, we're not meeting designation levels? Did you actually go to the labor board? I'm just wondering if you can answer those two specific questions.
Mr. Chairman, member opposite said, when designation levels aren't met, what happens? What does? First of all, I want to make it very clear. I don't do anything. In that case, I'm the Minister of Labour. What's that? Yeah. Mr. Chairman, I don't know what the conduct of this member is all about, but I've never seen the kind of conduct in this House that I've witnessed from this individual over the last number of weeks, quite frankly. If he wants to have a thoughtful conversation about this, we can do that. And that's what I'm attempting to do here, and I've always attempted to do this on the floor of the House. He wants to do this, or he wants to make a joke out of this whole thing, he can do that. Anyway, Mr. Chairman, he asked what is done, and what I was attempting to say is, first of all, nothing would come from our department on that, because that's not our role. Our role is to provide mediation services and to be as I said from the onset of this conversation, it's our job to create that balance and to make sure, in our view, in our department's view in this case, is that we need to bring clarity in order to demonstrate that balance. So he asked what happens when a designated level of service is not maintained. First and foremost, we would call, and I want to be very clear on this. The first goal is to bring a unionized worker into that role, and that's the way it will be under this legislation. So we call, we email, we reassign folks. Some folks have to come in off the picket line to maintain those levels, and this is because there's legitimate sickness. I mean, we've all gone through a period over the last number of years where we've gone through a global pandemic. And I want to say a huge thank you to the women and men out there who go to work every day and keep this system moving. And I know, despite all the theatrics across, the member opposite believes that too. But just consider that for a minute. We've gone through a global pandemic. People get sick. Consider what we just went through over the last couple of years. You might not be sick, but you might have to isolate because someone close to you was. And therefore, in that case, you have to bring somebody in off the picket line to fill some of those designated roles. So we would call them, we would email them, we'd reach out, and first and foremost, we would look to those unionized members under this legislation that is being proposed. And under this proposed legislation, union members will always be the first option. And it comes back, once again, to maintaining that level of service for the people of our province.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, he didn't answer my question. The reason why we need clarity, and I'm going to use your word, on designation levels, is that you're opening the door to scabs. And the justification you're using by opening the door to scabs is because designation levels are an issue. Now, I'm going to ask again, can you give me a concrete example of where designation levels were an issue? You know, when you speak to unions, and I know he's trying to say, well, there's, people fall sick in the pandemic and all that kind of stuff. They are very serious about designation levels. It's something that they respect and they follow. You know, they don't strike just for the fun of it. They strike because, they weren't able to come to an agreement with government. These are, the people working in these positions take their job very serious. They take it to heart. They don't like being on the sidewalk when they've got, kids in school, for example, if we're looking at teachers' assistants that need, that need help during the day. They don't like the fact that they're, on the sidewalk picketing when they know that they've got residents that require their assistance. They take designation levels very serious. So the minister is trying to spin this and say, well, there's issues and we're just bringing clarity, but there's already a process in place. So it's important for us to know, give us a concrete example of when designation levels were not met, and tell us why the process that's already in place is not sufficient to address, problems when they arise.
Mr. Chairman, I want to state very clearly that I know that members of a union don't go out on strike because they want to. And I have never suggested otherwise, either publicly or on the floor of this legislature. I have believed my entire life. I was on a picket line with my father when I was 5 years old. I believe in collective bargaining. I believe in the right to strike. And I understand that nobody goes out on strike because they want to. And I also would share the member opposite's opinion that they do take their designation levels seriously. I believe that both sides have a responsibility to take the level of designations seriously. All we're saying is that in the event, and there have been, you go back and you can read the Labor Board decisions. I'm not going to get into specific cases and single out one. He'd love me to do that. I know he'd love me to single out one profession, and then he'd get up and he'd grandstand and say I was singling out one bargaining unit or one profession, because that's the risk we run if we go down that road. He just has to go back and read some of the Labor and Employment Board decisions and realize that there were moments where there were concerns about maintaining that designation of service. And all we're saying is that in the event that that becomes problematic, there needs to be some options at the disposal of both sides in order to be able to maintain those services that that level of service that everybody has already agreed to. That's all we're trying to do.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'll ask you the question, what happens if designation levels can't be met just in normal times? What happens, when you fall into a strike? How is that, how, the way you're explaining it, is that burden falls, and not the blame, not just the burden, but the blame will fall on the unions. Well, the problem was there before the strike. The designation levels were there before the strike, and that's not the union's fault. That's not the members or the employees' fault. And what's happening is, if what you're saying is correct, if what you're saying is the reason why you're making these changes, then what you're doing is you're putting the blame on the unions and for the problem that's there. But they didn't create this problem. The problem was there before the strike. So I'm going to ask the minister, what happens in a situation where designation levels aren't met in normal times?
Chairman, I guess there were really two parts to that question, and I'll come first to the hold aspect of designation levels and how they're met during a work stoppage, and how I just want to make sure I go back to what the member opposite said here. You know what happens, if it's felt that some of those designations can't be met. I would argue that one of the aspects of this legislation that I think now brings clarity, I'm going to keep using that word, for both sides, is that both sides can apply to have those designation levels changed. If members from the labor movement think that the levels are set too high, they can also, under this legislation, appeal to the Labor and Employment Board for a change, just like the employer could. But at the end of the day, that's our whole point. This is not about a lopsidedness to anyone, whether to the employers or the employee. It's to give both sides the opportunity to appear before the Labor and Employment Board as they do now, but also give them some flexibility when they can come before the board. In terms of, I know the member opposite and I could probably debate this all day in terms of the current level of service outside of work stoppage when there isn't a strike happening. And look, we've had a number of conversations in this floor, but if he wants me to go back and talk about the things that we're doing in the health sector to try and make it easier not only to train but also to recruit, I can go through all that. We have a problem in this province. I mean, he knows that, I know that, and we're trying to deal with it. Whether or not it's making things more easier for internationally trained nurses, for instance, to come into this province and get their credentials recognized quicker, whether or not it's making sure that we actually get results from our post-secondary institutions in terms of training more nurses, whether it's, I know he's called it the Beale deal on a few occasions, but we did some work to think outside the box as to how we could get some students into a program as early as this winter through that. I mean, I understand that whole conversation and where he's going in terms of our current situation outside of work stoppage. That's not what we're here to talk about in this bill. We're here to talk about the framework around the rules that the Labor Employment Board has at their disposal in terms of how a designation level is set, and it's not lopsided. It's both sides or the Labor Employment Board. It is not giving it all to the employer here, and I know that's been part of the rhetoric, and I'm not saying the member opposite, but I've heard that buzzing out there that that's not what we're trying to accomplish here. So I think if we just stick to the whole issue at hand, it's so the Labor and Employment Board has some clarity around how the designations are set and how they can be maintained more importantly than anything else.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. The impression I get is that you're kind of throwing out, the concept of negotiating with the employees, with the unions. So when we're talking about designation levels, you're saying, well, they could apply to the board, we could apply to the board. Well, isn't there a long-standing tradition where the employer and employee actually sit down and kind of discuss what are appropriate designation levels? Like what I'm hearing, the impression that I'm getting on this side of the House is that the line of communication between the employer and the employee is being cut off. is being cut off, and that's the message that you're sending to, you know, the thousands of members, you know, who work in the public service, by saying that, you know, if there's issues with the designation level, we go to the board. You know, if we're opening the door to scabs, you know, like all of these things are sending the message that you guys are getting away from, you know, actually sitting down and bargaining with the different unions. And there's a long-standing tradition. And I know the minister got up and spoke about his father being part of the unions and stuff like that. But there's a long tradition here in New Brunswick, you know, where government has always negotiated in good faith, that both parties were always able to come to the table and hash out some of these details. And designation levels were one of those details that they hashed out together. But the message that you're sending is that you're getting away from that. So, you know, if you look, for example, the proposed change, 43.18, you know, where the employer would be able to apply to the Labour Board for amendments to the designation level up until 3 days after a deadlock has been declared. I'm just wondering, what's the justification of putting that in the legislation? I'm just wondering if the minister could actually explain why that is necessary now in the legislation.
Mr. Chairman, as the member opposite sat down, I said over to him, that's a good question, and I sincerely mean that. We're getting into the nuts and bolts of this legislation now, and I think that's important. And I want to make it very clear to him that we're not taking away anything here that affects the ability of both sides to sit down and come to an agreement. Everything starts, every negotiation starts with both sides sitting down and coming to an agreement and working it out first and foremost. Now, at the end of the day, I think, I could be wrong in this, but a very significant amount of the designation levels that have historically been set usually do involve the Labour and Employment Board coming in at the end and being that sort of mediator and determining what those levels are. But it starts with both sides sitting down and coming to that understanding first and foremost. And I'm going to say this, there is no attempt on my part to change that in this legislation. And if the member opposite can demonstrate to me how this legislation does that, I'll change it. But there's nowhere that takes anything away from both sides, and it is very important that if both sides don't come to an agreement and the Labour Employment Board has to become involved and work at setting those levels, they have to have very current information. They have to understand what kind of infrastructure is involved, because there could be new infrastructure that wasn't around before. There could be new facilities, new equipment. There could be new builds. There could be, we could have new hospitals, new schools, whatever the situation might be. So the situation has changed, and as they set those designation levels, all three parties here, the employer, the employee, and the Labour and Employment Board, have to take that into consideration. But at the end of the day, what this legislation does, and the way that it's always worked, quite frankly, is either side comes and says where they think they can apply to the board to have designation levels changed based on the reality of right now. And that's why we're trying to bring some clarity to the legislation so that it's current, that it's up to date. That's what we're trying to attempt to do here. So there is nothing in this bill, certainly no intention on my part, to lopside this one way or the other. And if the member opposite can demonstrate to me where that happens in here, I'll change it. But there's nothing in here that does that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. You know, this legislation will exist after our time. I know you would like to be Minister of Labour for the next 30 years. Chances are it won't happen. So what we're working on is legislation not for yourself, but for those who will come after you. So we got to make sure this is right. So even though your intentions are pure, we just have to be careful with what we're putting into the Act. Now, and again, you correct me if I'm wrong, we're going to dig into this, 43.18. So the way I see it is that, okay, we set designation levels. We've actually sat down with the unions, with the members. We've determined what designation levels are acceptable. But what's being proposed here in the bill is that the employer, which is government, could come back up to 3 days after a deadlock, so after a strike has been declared, and make amendments to the designation level. So what comes to mind for me is this a way of kind of, the term I'm going to use is back to work legislation, but it's kind of like we're using the back door to kind of maybe force, more employees back to work by raising the designation level. That's what I'm kind of seeing when I see the amendment. So I don't know if the minister wants to correct me because I'm way off track. If not, again, I come back to why are you putting something that seems heavy-handed off the, from the get-go, when we haven't really had any major issues beforehand with designation levels. So again, he hasn't told me that the process doesn't work. So that's why I'm a little bit concerned, and I'm questioning the purpose of 43.18.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to go back to my comments a few minutes ago about how it's important that the designation levels meet the current level at that time. And based on the reality, as I said a minute ago, could be new builds, new technology, new equipment, so on and so forth. And it all comes down to that balance. And I'm not in any way trying to take that balance and put it out of whack here. And I do agree with the member opposite when he says that we have a responsibility as legislators to make sure that what we're doing on the floor of this assembly doesn't have some unintended consequences down the road. But I want to read 43.18, subject to subsection 8.1, the employer or the bargaining agent. The employer or the bargaining agent for the relative bargaining unit may apply to the board to amend or order issued under subsection 4 or determination made under subsection 5. But it clearly states, right in the very first line of that section that you just referenced, the employer or the bargaining agent. This is about both sides being able to come and apply to the board to adjust it up or down depending on where they feel it should be based on relevant current information. So I don't see in any way, shape, or form how that lopsides it to one side. They both have that ability. Now, if you can explain to me out of that how that lopsides anything, Mr. Chairman, I'm all ears. But I think it's pretty clear.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The issue is that we're kind of doing the work twice, because if the employer and the employee actually sit down beforehand at the bargaining table and kind of not negotiate, but kind of settle or kind of agree on a designation level, well, that should be taken care of, and then obviously you can move on to the, to the bargaining part of the work that needs to be done. I understand that both parties could actually apply to the board, but the problem is if the employer applies to the board, then you're forcing the union to have to go in and to renegotiate these designation levels during a strike, where we should be putting our focus on trying to resolve the strike, focus our energy on, what is a sticking point? Why can't we come to an agreement? So I just feel that by adding this, we're kind of doing the work twice. Again, if you were to come to me and say, you know what, in the past, there's a history of us having issues with designation levels, and, you know, when we actually sat down at the table, we could never come to an agreement. If that was the case, then I would completely understand why we need to put this in the legislation. But from my understanding, there was never such a situation. And again, maybe I'm wrong or the information that I'm getting is not accurate. But if there's not a problem, then why do we have to come out in force and put, you know, take an extra step and put this in the legislation now? Again, there is a process in place to figure out what, you know, what are acceptable designation levels. Unless the minister, you know, comes out and says, you know, we've had issues in the past, it just doesn't work, then maybe we should remove this section from the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I think I said a couple of questions ago, it was good to kind of get into the nuts and bolts of this. And the member opposite's given me an opportunity to get in and to clarify quite a bit of stuff here now, which, Mr. Chairman, is actually quite helpful. And I think it's important to note that there's nothing that is being done here that takes away, as I've said, I think I've tried to say that we want both sides to be able to come together long before we need any of this. And a lot of this is already in place, you know, in terms of either side applying to the Labour and Employment Board for a change in the designation. Our first and foremost hope has always been that both sides would sit down, work through. We don't need legislation for that. That's there as part of collective bargaining. What we're talking about is the process when both sides can agree and they can apply to the Labour and Employment Board at that point. I think it's also important to note that designations can't be changed during a strike. I mean, I think you had said a few minutes ago, you know, during a strike, we want both sides to come to the table and work out a deal. Yeah, absolutely. But designations can't change at that point. The only thing that's being changed here is the way it currently is that you have up until a conciliation officer is appointed to change designations. But sometimes after you go to conciliation and that officer is appointed, we've had situations where that can take several years. A lot can change in the work environment at that point. All we're doing is if there becomes a deadlock, then either side, and I go back to either side, has 3 days after that deadlock to apply for a change. Only 3 days. And then after that, a decision will be made and those levels will get established. And if that's whether a strike happens or not. But that's long before we get into a strike situation. And that's why I'm trying to drive home here. This has nothing to do with trying to lopside things one way or the other or take away the ability of the employees to negotiate during a strike. Because once the strike has happened, the designation levels are already established.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. You know, the minister is making it seem just so, you know, there's no issue, everything is great, we're just kind of, you know, dotting the I's and crossing our, you know, the T's and stuff like that, and, you know, the process will still be in place, but it's, again, it's the message that you're sending to the members that, you know, in case there is a horrible situation or in case that we can't come to an agreement, you know, this is what will happen. But there's never been an issue where, you know, you weren't able to, you know, to come to an agreement. And again, if they go through that process, like imagine it's hard for them because, you know, and then again, I'm going to come back to the fact that, you know, obviously the goal for the employer and the employees is to find an agreement that is fair and that is reasonable. But sometimes it doesn't happen, so they have to go on strike, and it's their right to do so. But if they do go on strike and there is designation levels already determined and government asks to change those designation levels up to 3 days after a strike, well then it puts everything in chaos, because what happens is, while they don't know who's going to be on strike, who's not going to be on strike, it's like you're asking them to come back to the bargaining table without knowing what the designation levels are going to be, who's going to be, you know, it just creates more chaos than anything else. So I think if you were really sincere about the fact that, listen, the negotiation part, you know, is important for you or is important for government or the employer, then again, why be so heavy-handed with this legislation? Like, I think it's just overkill. Basically, that's what I come down, the question, I'm trying to get the most information I can. Obviously, I'm limited with time, but I think it's just overkill, honestly. And there's no reason for it in the legislation. So I've got to move on because I've got other issues or other subjects that I want to touch on. Well, you can answer, yes.
I just think that it's important to bring some clarification there. You said a few minutes ago that they have 3 days after there's a strike. Hopefully I was clear on that. We're not talking about changing. You cannot change the designation levels after there's a strike, and there is no attempt to change that. This is 3 days after there's an impasse in negotiations. That's all this is when they've come to a deadlock. So I don't want to, I needed to clarify that because my whole point from day one is that this is not to interfere after there's a work stoppage and when there's a strike situation with the designations in any way, shape, or form. That's not what we're trying to do here. So I wanted to be clear. You said 3 days after a strike. That's not what I had said, and I just wanted to make sure we were clear on that.
Mr. Chair, thank you for that clarification. And you're right, probably I did say strike. And you're right, I think it's good that you clarified that. So that kind of opens up the door to my next point, where it's like, so unions or members or public service employees who decide to go on strike have to give notice of 3 days to government. Where if you flip it around, if government wants to lock them out, they only need to give them 24 hours. Is that something that is being done everywhere else in the country? Is that something that you guys came up with? Like, how did you guys end up with those numbers?
Get a little bit of a jurisdictional scan here on that and get the member opposite some information if you just give me a moment here. So, Mr. Chairman, just a quick little jurisdictional scan of other jurisdictions, and to the member opposite's point, it varies in every jurisdiction, but In terms of the 72 hours, Alberta and British Columbia both require 3 days' notice from the union to give them notice. In Newfoundland and in Quebec, there's a full week that they have to give notice. So our 72 hours is significantly more. I hate to use the word generous. That's not what I mean, but you get the point I'm trying to make. And I would argue much more reasonable. That's the question. I would say that ours is much more reasonable than some other jurisdictions that require a much longer period for the union to give notice before they can go out on strike.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm not going to make a debate here about the 72 hours. I mean, if it varies from province to province, that's fine. But again, it comes down to perception, where it's like you're asking the unions to give, notification 72 hours in advance, but then the employer turns around and says, well, we can lock you guys out after 24 hours. So again, it comes back to that perception of fair bargaining practice. So you mentioned the examples of unions having to give a 72-hour notice, but what about examples of, when it comes to government being able to use, their lockout power? Is that in other provinces or the provinces that you just named, can you also maybe specify what government has to give as a notice?
To the member opposite, first of all, in terms of the jurisdictional scan on that, in terms of what is required of governments, I'm going to have to get back to you on that because I just don't have that particular jurisdictional scan. But what I would say is I'll give you the rationale why the difference. The reason you want 72 hours for strike notice is because government has the responsibility to deliver and maintain the service. And government needs time to put a plan in place to make sure that's there. The employees, on the other hand, they don't have that same requirement. So that's why, in terms of the lockout, it's only 24 hours. But we can get back to you on the other. The other thing, I want to reiterate what I said a minute ago in terms of other jurisdictions. It varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. There's no cookie cutter approach on this. In fact, I would point out there's other jurisdictions that don't allow strikes at all, that things go right to binding arbitration. So that would be the difference also with some other jurisdictions, which isn't the case here in New Brunswick.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And again, you know, I don't want to make a debate about the 72 hours. I completely understand where it's like, you know, if there is going to be a strike, government has to continue delivering services, whether it's in, you know, special care homes or you know, or social workers and all that kind of stuff. And that I agree with. There's no issue there. But the 24-hour lockout, like, you know, think of the parents, for example, you know, for teachers' assistants, or think of, you know, kids who have parents in special care homes. You know, if there's just a 24-hour notice, my concern is that is probably not sufficient. Like, if you're saying that government needs time to adjust or to get ready for the strike, while the parents also need time if government were to decide to use the lockout card. You know, the people who have parents, like I mentioned, or, you know, certain departments where, you know, who receive services, like, they're going to need time to adjust. So wouldn't it just be reasonable to say, listen, if we're going to require this on one side, then we'll have to require it on both sides. So why not come to an agreement or sit down with the union and say, listen, what's a reasonable time frame? Like, do we, you know, do we settle on a week each? Or, you know, so I think the fact that there was no consultation, I think for them it's like, well, like, we didn't ask for this. Like, we never actually talked about it. So that's why I keep coming back, and I made my points, and I don't want to get into a shouting match here, where it's like they feel like they've been blindsided by this legislation for those reasons. So we're just trying to, you know, get through it and say, okay, well, listen, maybe this is not the greatest approach, the 24 hours, for those reasons specifically. Let's put the bargaining aside and just think of, you know, who will this affect if government decides to lock out the public service employees.
I guess, Mr. Chairman, the only thing I'll say, and I take the point, the member opposite, I go back to my point all along is that this is all about balance, and I think the differences in why it was set up 72 hours and 24 makes some sense. It was reasonable. You know, I take the other points the member makes, but At the end of the day, I believe that lockouts historically have been extremely rare in the province. That it has happened. It has happened recently, but it is something that happens very rarely. And at the end of the day, I do think that based on the reasons that I just gave a few minutes ago, that we've had a reasonable approach. The member opposite may disagree with me on that. That's fine, but I think I've already explained the logic behind it.
Thank you very much. For those who are listening, I kind of just want to, obviously it's not something that we agree with, so logically you'd bring in an amendment to change, the bill that's being proposed, but obviously, what they need to understand is we're so limited in time when it comes to committee that if I bring an amendment for every little thing I want to change, it would take us like 2 hours, and then I wouldn't have any time for questions. So I do have an amendment, but I'll bring that a little bit, I'll bring that forward. So I had to actually choose the amendments I wanted to bring, in order to make changes to the bill. So let's continue on my question. So I kind of want to understand the reasons for allowing public service employees to picket on the job site. There's been a long, standing tradition where unions would not picket on the job site, and in return, government would not bring in scab workers. And that's been kind of like, a non-written agreement that's been, been working over many, decades, I would even say. I asked, straight out unions, like, is this something that's been in the hopper? Like, have you been asking government for years to be able to strike, on the work site? And they said, no, like, this did not come from us. So I'm wondering, like, who instigated this? Where did you get the idea? Again, people want to know.
So, thank you, Mr. Chairman. To the member opposite, quite frankly, and I want to reiterate what I've said throughout the afternoon here. This has never, ever been about trying to take away anyone's right to strike or their rights around the ability to strike. And I know that we've had some heated exchanges on that, but that has been fundamentally the premise here all along, that this is simply about protecting essential services, period. And so having said that, it was very important to me personally as Minister of Labour that because, and I know when things like this happen, there's always the perception, and I'm doing my best to try and take that perception away, that this is about taking anything from anybody. But you know that that perception's bound to take hold, and when the opposition, and I don't mean this in a negative way. I've been in opposition twice. You've got a job to do, and you've got to hold us accountable. I get that. But through that process creates certain perceptions. And what I wanted to accomplish through putting this in place was to try and drive home that this is about balance. And I don't think government should dictate where strikers can picket at a place of employment. And that's ultimately what this was about. I said a few minutes ago that I had been on a picket line with my father when I was younger, and I can remember. I see the member from Bathurst here today. I remember being in a Labor Day parade in Bathurst many years ago. I think it was 1980 was the exact year, and I wasn't very old at that point. And my father instilled in me that whole value around the right to strike. So having said that, I thought this was an opportunity to demonstrate that balance and give the unions and the public sector unions a little bit more leeway around where they could strike in the event of a work stoppage, and that's what this was about.
I'm weighing my words here because I just want to lash out, because this is, you are spinning this is rhetoric, and it's a crock of you know what. Because what you're saying one thing, but you're doing something different. And shame on you for doing this. Shame on you, Minister, for doing this. What you're doing is you're deliberately creating chaos on the work site. You want to talk about balance? There was balance. There was this long-standing tradition that unions would not strike, on the work site or in the workplace, and that government would not bring in scab workers. You're throwing that out the window, and you're deliberately bringing unions on the work site because you know that'll create chaos. And then the next section, the 102.1, when you're going to bring in scabs, you want that chaos on the picket line, and you want these members to have to cross a picket line, and you want that chaos amongst them, between them. This is deliberate. This is not about creating balance. This is not about clarity. This was, you're being proactive, and this is actually an attack on unions and fair bargaining practice. That's exactly what it is, and shame on you. My concern, and I said it during, my speech, and I actually even asked you during question period, is nobody wants to be on strike. It's, it creates a lot of tension for people who are affected, and it creates a lot of tension for the employees because they're going without salary. They're having to leave their job that they love. And now you're putting them in a situation where you're probably asking colleagues to have to cross a picket line, and, you're pitting them one against another. So, and you and you're okay with getting up here on the ledge and saying, well, you want to create balance, you want to bring clarity to the bill and all that kind of stuff? Come on. Come on, everybody could, we could read between the lines. It's a farce. So now that you're given permission to unions to strike on the work site, let's talk about the scabs that you want to bring in. So there's two points that you put into the amendment or to the bill, that the employer may replace an employee employed in a designated position with another employee from a different from a union that's not on strike. So again, obviously you didn't consult with the unions beforehand. They weren't aware that this was coming, that this was being worked on. So what's the justification for it? Like, again, if you were to come to me, and then this comes back to designation levels. I think Paula Doucette, I think, was on she did an article, and she says in her 27 years of nursing experience and 20 years as a union leader, not once have we come into issues where we couldn't agree to essential services in the health care sector. 27 years. And then yet you're bringing in this legislation in case there's an issue. Well, there's never been an issue. So what's the justification for it? Well, you weren't able to answer that question. So again, I'm coming to this, to the scab legislation that you're tabling. What's the justification for bringing in scab legislation?
Mr. Chairman, I've answered this question to the member opposite a number of times, both here today and in question period. The fact of the matter is, there is nothing in this legislation that allows the employer to arbitrarily change the designation levels. This is about meeting an essential level of service. This is about the health and safety of New Brunswickers. In the event that designated levels that both sides have agreed to can't be met. I've said that over and over again. There is nothing in this legislation that gives the employer, in this case the government, the ability to go in and break a strike. There is no way through this legislation that the type of replacement workers that he keeps referring to would come in a non-designated role and replace unionized workers to break a strike. That's not what this is. He can get up and grandstand, and I guess, we were having a great conversation for about an hour, and he's right back to his rhetoric again. I mean, he can do that all night if he wants, where we can talk about what this legislation isn't, so that we can bring some clarity to this once and for all, so that people don't run around thinking that there's something happening here that isn't. I don't know how many more ways I can say it. This is not about breaking a strike. This is not about bringing in replacement workers to break a strike. Never was, nor would I ever support that. I have been clear every time this issue has come up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. You talk about perception, but you're creating this false narrative. While designation levels are concerned, and that's why we're bringing in, legislation to address that. And then, if designation levels aren't met, then we're going to have to open the door to replacement workers or scab workers. There's no issue to begin with. So why are you kind of, creating this false narrative and say, well, hypothetically, if this happens, this is what we'll do, and if this, well, it's never happened. Shouldn't we just trust the process that's in place now, and shouldn't we just trust that the employer-employee will be able to negotiate in a fair and responsible way and find answers, themselves, or, be able to address these situations without actually having the strong arm of the law come in and say, well, this is what we're going to do in such and such a case? So if I go to 102.1.4, so where it gives the employer the power to bring in, employees from another sector. And again, hypothetically speaking, if designation levels aren't met, I know you talked about, this is not about replacing non-designated position. If designation levels are not met, which probably never happened, probably won't ever happen, but if they weren't met, you're saying here that you can bring employees from another sector and have them, do the work in the sector that's being affected by the strike. Now, obviously, there's a labor shortage a little bit everywhere. Every department's being affected by the labor shortage. We're already struggling to find employees to fill these positions. The second thing is a lot of these positions are very technical. You need certification and all that kind of stuff. So where does the minister expect to find employees that are certified to do or qualified to do the job, in these sectors? Like, are these employees hiding somewhere? Like, could you have like a closet where you can just pick and choose? Okay, well, we need more social workers. We'll just, go into this room and pick out a few social workers and just kind of, move them on to the, the affected area. So you put this on paper, but if it were to go forward, like, how would this work? Can you explain, Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, just with respect to the whole question, where would we find folks to maintain these designated levels? I want to stress very clearly that our first option, probably even our second and third option, we would do everything we could to make sure that a unionized employee is called upon, call them, email them, do everything we get to fill those designated roles. In terms of who, here another one chiming in over there. In terms of when that's exhausted, it could be anyone throughout government. It could be managers that were once unionized employees that have that skill set that could step in. It could be other units across government. In terms of redeployment, we've had a number of people during challenges, and once again, these are designated levels of service to protect New Brunswickers. So you have to think outside the box to do that. I mean, during COVID, when we were in a crisis, and we had to we had to keep a certain level, in some cases a new level of service, we took employees from one end of government to another and redeployed them. There were over 150 people in our department that were redeployed to various things to maintain a required level of service to keep the health and safety of New Brunswickers protected. And that's what this is about. We had librarians that, because libraries were closed, they were redeployed into other areas. Not to replace designated workers and break a strike, but to deal with a situation where people legitimately called in sick, where we never know whether we're going to be in another pandemic, or we've seen influenza rise over the last number of weeks here. If we had a work stoppage in the middle of all of this, there could be a number of areas. It could be tough to maintain those designated levels. So that's what we would do. But at the end of the day, I can't stress enough that we would do everything imaginably possible to make sure that a unionized employee would fill that role to begin with.
Mr. Chair, this bill doesn't hold water. Like the two points that, or the two changes that he wants to make or bring in, doesn't make any sense. Like, can you tell me how many radiologists or lab technicians work in Petal? Come on, you're going to redeploy who? Like, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. You know, so you're giving yourself the capacity to redeploy people from other departments to replace employees, let's say hypothetically that designation levels aren't met, but these are all specialized professions. Teachers' assistants, lab technicians, radiologists, like it doesn't make any sense that this is in the bill. It's just a scare tactic, that's all it is. And to open it up to the private sector, where are you going to find radiologists in the private sector? Or teachers' assistants, or lab technicians? They already work for the public sector, and they're all part of the same union. So if you can't agree with that union, then everyone is on strike. So unless the deputy minister is a radiologist, and he can be redeployed, there's no way that you're filling these positions, none whatsoever. Like, I wish I had so much more time, because there's just so many more questions that I'd like to ask, but obviously we're so limited. But I think I've made my point with these, with what you're trying to bring in here. You're creating chaos by letting unions, by opening the door to say, listen, you can pick it now, on the job site. You're creating chaos by saying you're going to bring in scab workers, either redeploy them from other departments or from the private sector. You can't answer the question where you say, well, where are these radiologists hiding? We have a labor shortage. We don't have enough in the public sector as it is. So wouldn't it be a lot more reasonable to say, you know what, let's cherish the ones that we do have, let's work with the ones we do have, and let's make sure that they don't go on strike. And what does that mean? Well, that means you guys have to go to the bargaining table and negotiate in a fair and reasonable manner. That's how we resolve problems, Mr. Chair. Not by putting these, overkill laws that hypothetically if this happens and that happens. This is basically a scare tactic because they're in negotiation now and there's big negotiations coming and it doesn't make any sense. So I'd like to bring an amendment because obviously 102.14 and 102.15, they don't make any sense whatsoever. So there's no sense of having it in the bill. So the amendment that I'd like to bring forward, Mr. Chair, is to amend the bill as follows. So strike out subsection 102.14 and 102.15. So simple as that. And I've made copies for everyone, so there you go. Thank you very much.
Very organized of you to make copies for everyone.
At the end of the day, these two sections, Mr. Chairman,
It has been moved by the member from Tracadie-Shiloh that section number 18 be amended as follows. Paragraph B, strike out subsections 102.1 section 4 and 102.1 section 5. Are there any questions or comments on the amendment?
no, just simply that we can't support this, Mr. Chairman. These are the two sections that allow us to maintain that level of service that we're talking about.
Are there comments or questions before we go to the vote on the amendment? Seeing that there are none, is it the pleasure of the committee to adopt the amendment? All those in favor, please say yea. Yea. All those opposed, please say nay. Nay. In my opinion, the nays have it. I will declare the amendment defeated. Would there be any further questions on the bill? I'd like to recognize the member for Fredericton South and leader of his party.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do have some questions around Bill 23 for the minister. I want to start with the fact the bill changes the deadline for the designation order amendment applications. So the application to amend the designation order deadline is altered by the bill. And it would seem to me that will create a situation where last-minute applications by the government to amend a designation level will effectively change the rules of the game, which will result in chaos. Why would the minister see that there would be any other outcome other than that by changing, effectively changing the rules of the game with this ability to apply for changes to the designation order at the last minute?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the member opposite for the question. Actually, we got into this at quite at length earlier in the conversation earlier, but I'm pleased to reiterate this for the member opposite. First of all, the way that it's currently laid out, and I want to come back to my whole point that it isn't just one side that can apply for changes in the designated levels. Both sides have always been able to do that, and no one side can unilaterally make changes to those designations without either coming to an agreement between the employer and the employee, or the Labour and Employment Board deciding for them or mediating that conversation. But first and foremost, we hope that both sides would work that out. The only thing that has changed, and the member opposite said that it's later in the game, currently the way the current mechanism allows for you to change the designated levels up until a conciliation officer is appointed. This would just simply change it to for 3 days. You could still apply for 3 days after there's a deadlock, and both sides could do that. It's not just the employer. And that's because, as I explained earlier, a whole lot of things could have changed in the meantime. There could be new equipment, could be new facilities. We've had conciliation that's gone on for a year or two at a time, and a whole lot of things can change in that environment, where either the designation levels could either go up or down. And so both sides have the ability to make sure that the Labour and Employment Board has the ability to consider current relevant information that may have changed over the course of, in some cases, a year or two.
Well, it will make strike votes invalid after a year. So the question to the minister is, why wouldn't that incent unions to go on strike before they lose that mandate as the year end approaches? Why wouldn't this lead to more strikes?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Actually, there's a number of reasons for the 1 year. First of all, it's 1 year under the Labor Relations Act, so it would be consistent with that act. We don't see any more strikes as a result of that, Mr. Speaker. I would also say to the member opposite that it's much more flexible at a year than it is with the federal government, because under the Canadian Labour Code it's 60 days and the strike vote expires. So certainly a year is much more flexible than that. And on top of that, it just simply makes sure that the mandate is current with the membership. There's nothing that prevents them from immediately taking another strike vote, and that would be also overseen by the Labour and Employment Board, which is an impartial third body. So this would be very consistent with the Labour Relations Act, and certainly much more, as I said, flexible than under the Canadian Labour Code.
With the changes that this bill would make to binding arbitration, it seems to me that very few unions would actually ever want to go to binding arbitration. And that's a shame. It would take that as a potential good dispute resolution tool mechanism out of play. So why would you make these changes to the binding arbitration provisions in this bill?
Just with respect to the member opposite's question, I would argue that binding arbitration is rarely used now, and to start with, and this actually, in many ways, may provide an opportunity to use it more. This will be consistent with the changes that have been made to the Industrial Relations Act, and I know there was quite a debate here a few years ago around police and fire. But at the end of the day, in that situation, and these criteria would mirror the criteria put in place there, but we've actually had a number of situations where good agreements have come to place where they haven't even had to use binding arbitration since that has happened. And I would also say, too, and I don't have the list in front of me, I had it at one point, but I can get it for you. There are a number of other Canadian jurisdictions, and something tells me even the federal government that has criteria around binding arbitration and what the arbitrators can use to determine already. So this is basically trying to be a little bit more harmonized in that approach. This is not something that doesn't happen elsewhere, and it already happens in the Industrial Relations Act, and quite frankly, so far it's worked quite well.
Thank you. At this time, we're going to take a 5-minute break, 5-minute health break. We'll be right back. Thank you. I'd like to call the meeting. I'd like to call the the meeting back to order, and we thank you all for being back on time. I said 5:08. The clock has started. I did. Once again, I'd like to recognize a member from Fredericton South and leader of his party.
Mr. Chair, as a third party, we operate under particularly severe time constraints with time allocation, and my time is up.
Are there any other questions or comments on the bill before we go to the vote? Seeing that there are none, Mr. Minister, would you have any closing comments?
No, I just want to say thanks for the questions. I know that some of the questions were passionate, and I want to thank my staff for being here with me today and for the work that they continue to do in the Department of Labour. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We'll just give your staff a moment to exit before we go to call for the vote. Is it the pleasure of the committee that bill number 23, an act to amend the Public Service Labor Relations Act, stand as presented, and that I report the bill as agreed to? All those in favor, please say yay. Yay. All those opposed, please say nay. Nay. In my opinion, the yeas have it, and I'll declare the motion carried. Thank you all very, very much. With that motion, we will conclude today's session, and we appreciate everybody's participation. I'll adjourn the meeting.